Chapter 6. Makenna showed up at 9 a.m. on the dot the next morning, and although Bubba wasn't sure what help he would be able to provide, he was glad for the excuse to get out of the house for a few hours. He loved his parents, and he loved catching up with them, but the emotional intensity had been a little much for him to handle. He hadn't been that close to anyone in the last 5 years. "You ready?" Makenna asked him as he slid into the passenger seat of her cruiser. "As I'll ever be, I guess." "How was the reunion?" Her eyes glanced his way for only a moment, but he could tell his answer was important to her. He couldn't imagine the weight she must be carrying. "It was good. I'd almost forgotten how much I missed having a family. I think I spent half the time just staring at them to prove to myself it was real." Her jaw tightened, and he knew he had just made her feel worse, even though that wasn't his intention. "Makenna, I don't blame you. You did what you thought was right." His words probably wouldn't relieve the guilt she was placing on herself, but he had to try. "Thank you, Bubba. But I can't get back the time you lost, and that's a little hard to come to grips with." There was nothing he could say at this point to change her mind, so he decided to change the subject instead. "Where are we going?" "First stop is coffee, and then we'll hit Peter's repair shop." "Sounds good." Bubba stared out the window as Makenna drove through town. Not much had changed. The post office still looked the same, and the parking lot still held the flagpole, where the faded American flag waved gently in the breeze. Bubba was glad to see it still flying. There had been a debate over whether to take it down shortly before he'd left town. Evidently some new residents found it offensive, something Bubba would never understand. A frozen yogurt store with a large neon sign was new, as was some sort of gaming center. At least that's what he assumed it was from the name Creative Consoles. And then there were the new hotels. He had never understood why the town had so many hotels. They had no claim to fame, no big sports team, no prestigious university, not even a famous statue like some of the towns near them. So what brought people to Woodville? Was it the feeling of peace and tranquility the surrounding woods provided? Was it its location away from big cities? Was it the promise of a simpler life that the downtown buildings seemed to boast with their faded paint and weathered signage? The coffee shop she pulled into was not the same one Bubba had frequented when he lived here, as they were on the other side of town from the firehouse, but it was bustling nonetheless. He could remember a time when there was only one coffee shop in town, and it was never busy. Now patrons filled every table, and a line of at least 5 more stood waiting to order. "Busy place," Bubba remarked as he took in the interior, which appeared much like most other coffee shops he had been in. The walls were a soft tan color, which was brought out in the tile flooring. Tables capable of sitting 4 filled the room, with a few smaller tables made for 2 by the windows. And one small couch sat nestled in the corner, surrounded by a reading lamp and a glass table. A man immersed in his laptop took up most of the couch, and his books filled the other side. He lifted his mug to sip every few seconds, but never seemed to look away from his screen. "I know," Makenna said with a frown as she checked her watch, "but it's the best coffee in town, I think, so it's worth the wait." The line moved quickly, and they reached the front in under 10 minutes. "Welcome to Love a Latte," the employee said as she placed the previous payment in the register. "How can I—" Her words cut off as she raised her eyes and met Bubba's gaze. The color drained from her face as if she'd seen a ghost, which in his case he guessed she sort of had. "Oh my Lanta, as I live and breathe? Matt Fisher, is that you?" "It is," Bubba said quietly, hoping she would do the same. But he should have known better. Daphne Rogers had been a cheerleader and a prominent thespian in high school. 2 things that rarely seemed to go together, but worked for Daphne. Outgoing and bubbly, temerity was not her strong suit. "I thought you were dead. Everyone said you died in the house fire 5 years ago." Heads turned their direction as her words floated over the hum of conversation. "Matt Fisher? I thought he died. Who's Matt Fisher?" Bubba felt the eyes of the customers on his back, and he turned and offered a small smile and a wave. Most simply stared at him in confusion, but one pair of eyes seemed to burn with an angry intensity. He stared back at the woman, curious as to why she might have so much hatred toward him, but he didn't recognize her. At least, he didn't think he did. Perhaps she was just angry that his entrance had disintegrated her silence. The laptop in front of her might hold her work as it did for the man on the couch, or a book. "It's a long story," Makenna spoke up beside him. "Can we just get our coffees to go?" Her authoritative voice dragged his attention back to Daphne, who still stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Sure, sorry, I didn't mean to blow your cover. I'm just so glad to know you're not dead." She gazed at Bubba a little longer than necessary before taking their orders and payment. Bubba still felt as if every eye was on him and every whisper discussed him as they waited at the end of the counter for the drinks. "It's going to be like this everywhere, isn't it?" "It's what I was hoping for, honestly," Makenna whispered back. "Word will spread like wildfire, and hopefully the killer will tip his hand." "And if he doesn't?" Makenna's lips pinched together and she shook her head. Evidently, she didn't want to think about that possibility either. They stood in silence for a minute until their drinks were placed on the counter. Then, drinks in hand, they made their way out of the shop. Bubba sighed with relief as he slid into the passenger seat. He was not used to being the focus of attention, and it would only get worse when Natasha's article came out. "So, how do you know Daphne Rogers?" Makenna asked as she pulled her door shut, closing the two of them off from prying eyes and ears. "She seemed mighty interested in you." He took a sip of his coffee as he debated his answer. It was good, the hazelnut just strong enough to add flavor. "We went to high school together. She was the head cheerleader, and I was the captain of the football team, so everyone expected us to be together. I think she wanted to date me, but I was looking for a woman with a little more substance to her." Daphne had been pretty, with her auburn hair and bright green eyes, and she certainly was adored by everyone at the school. But Bubba had tried having a few conversations with her, and every time he had left feeling as if a few intelligent points had trickled out of his brain, so he'd never been able to date her. "Vapid?" Makenna asked as she pulled out of the parking lot. Bubba smiled at her. "To say the least. She hounded me all through school, and she would try to stop by the firehouse when she knew I was working." "Do you think she felt slighted by you?" "Enough to kill people?" Bubba couldn't believe they were having this conversation about Daphne Rogers of all people. She hadn't even dissected the frog in biology because of her aversion to blood and all things disgusting. Her exact words, if he remembered correctly. Makenna shrugged, and after sipping her own coffee, placed it in the middle cup holder. "Sometimes the visage we see is not the real person underneath." "Visage? I don't think I've heard that word since high school English class." A soft pink colored Makenna's cheeks, and she averted her gaze from his as she inserted the key into the ignition. "I may be guilty of reading a few classic novels in my free time." Bubba chuckled. He was guilty of the same thing. At the firehouse, he hid his books under the mattress so as not to get razzed by Luca. He'd seen Bubba reading A Tale of Two Cities once and teased him mercilessly for the next week. "I'm guilty too, but I think you're wrong about Daphne. What you see is pretty much what you get, and I can't imagine her starting fires." "You're probably right," Makenna sighed. "I'm just so focused on finding this guy that I'm seeing connections where there might be nothing." "We'll find him." But as Bubba leaned back in the seat, he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure Makenna or himself more. "Was this always here?" Bubba asked as they pulled into Peter's repair shop. "I don't remember an auto repair shop here before." Makenna turned off the engine and stared out the windshield at the large black tire atop a metal pole that sat to the right of the building. Above the door, the sign read, "Peter's Parts." "No, you wouldn't. It used to be a butcher shop until Peter converted it a few years ago. Seemed like a nice enough guy, a little rough on the exterior, but good at his job." "So, what are you hoping to find here?" She turned to face him and shrugged. "I honestly don't know. A disgruntled employee, a jealous ex, a secret smuggling operation? Some reason for someone to want him dead." One corner of her mouth twitched up into a half smile. "I'm reaching at this point, but what have I got to lose?" "I'll follow your lead then," Bubba said and then opened his door. Makenna was actually a little surprised to see the open sign on the door. It was a small business, and she only knew of one other employee besides Peter. Was he trying to run it on his own? She supposed there could have been more than just the one guy she knew of. She'd only been here a couple of times when the check engine light came on in her cruiser. Though usually nothing, she could never ignore warning signs in her official vehicle, like she could in her own car. They always had to be in perfect working order, just in case. The soft tinkling of an overhead bell announced their entrance, and a blonde popped up from behind the counter. Sparkly was the best word Makenna could come up with to describe her. Her tightly curled hair, most likely from a perm, fell to her shoulders. Glittery eyeshadow covered her lids, and her mouth glistened with some shade of pink. In addition, her top sported sequins that caught the light and appeared to shimmer. She looked anachronistic, like she belonged on a bad 80s sitcom instead of current time. Makenna had heard of previous fashions coming back in style, but even if that was the case, and she certainly hoped it wasn't, this was quite the odd outfit choice for someone working in a repair shop. "Who are you?" Makenna asked. She'd never seen this woman before. She rarely forgot faces, and this getup was one that would regrettably be burned into her retinas for some time. The girl placed her hands akimbo on her hips, and Makenna expected her to smack gum loudly in her mouth as she spoke. "I'm Skye. Who are you?" No gum, but the effect was still there. "I'm Captain Makenna Drake. Do you work here, Skye?" "Do I look like I work here?" she asked, rolling her eyes. "No. I'm Peter's ex-girlfriend. He owed me money, and I came to collect what I was owed." "You can't steal money from his shop." Makenna hoped she wasn't going to have to arrest this woman and book her for theft. That hadn't been on her plans for the day, and would mean paperwork to fill out, sucking her time from the more important matter at hand of finding a killer. "I'm not stealing. I'm taking what's mine. He owed me $100. She raised one manicured hand to flick her blonde hair off her shoulder. Makenna's eyes narrowed as her intuition perked into gear. As the saying went, money was the root of all evil, and she'd seen men killed for less. An ex-girlfriend with a monetary vendetta certainly had motive, and Skye had just made herself a suspect. What for? For spilling beer on my purse. I had to throw it away because I couldn't get the smell out. She wrinkled her nose and shivered, but he promised he'd buy me a new one. Course, then I saw him schmoozing with my ex-best friend a few days later. That's when we broke up. But he still owes me the money for the purse he ruined. Makenna's head spun, and she glanced at Bubba to see if he found this as preposterous as she did. He shrugged and shook his head, clearly agreeing with her unspoken question. Did this woman have any idea how much motive she had just laid out before Makenna? Somehow she doubted it. "Let me get this straight. Your boyfriend ruined your purse and cheated on you with your best friend." Skye's eyes widened as she nodded. "See? You get it. He wasn't a great boyfriend anyway, but cheaters get what they deserve." "Uh-huh. Skye, where were you 2 nights ago?" Makenna asked. This woman hardly looked capable of killing a spider should it run across her path, let alone a man. But not only did she have motive, she had also just stated that Peter had gotten what he deserved. Makenna would be remiss if she didn't at least ask. "You mean when Peter was killed?" Skye's tone stayed completely even, as if the thought of his death didn't affect her at all. "I was with Nick. Nick, come here and tell this fine police officer about our second date." Nick stepped out of the work bay area, a complete opposite of Skye, as he was covered in grease and had at least one tattoo that Makenna could see peeking from his collar. She assumed the bulging muscles protruding from his sleeves was what attracted Skye to him. "You're dating Peter's employee?" Makenna asked. Now she suddenly had 2 suspects. Did Peter know? "He saw us together the night before he was killed," Skye said with a shrug, as if this sort of thing happened every day. "Made a big scene about it and everything. I don't know why, since he was still with my ex-best friend." Makenna felt like slapping her forehead or pinching herself to make sure this was real. This situation was more like a B horror movie than actual life. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring you both in for questioning." "What for? Sky's wide eyes appeared clueless. Did she really not understand what she had just admitted? For saying too much, Nick hissed under his breath. Clearly, he was the brains in the relationship, which Makenna wasn't sure was saying much. You just made us both suspects in Peter's death. What? But we didn't kill Peter. I can't be arrested. I can't have mugshots. I'm not arresting you. Makenna couldn't believe this woman was more worried about mugshots than a possible murder rap. Not yet. But I do need to ask you a few questions. If you come with me, I won't have to pull out the handcuffs. I'll answer whatever you need as long as there are no mugshots. I can't believe you got me into this, Nick grumbled as he glared at Sky. Now I have to close the shop and lose money. Makenna rolled her eyes at Bubba as she opened the back door for Nick and Sky. She'd quit her job on the spot if either of these two turned out to be the arsonist. Still, with so few leads, she couldn't let any possibility slip through her fingers. Looks like we'll be making a slight detour before talking to family. Do you mind? Bubba shrugged his broad shoulders. I've got nothing else to do today. Makenna flashed him a grateful smile. She felt taxed and overburdened by this case, but just having Bubba around calmed her a little. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the sheer masculinity he exuded. Maybe it was that he had been involved in the original case. Maybe it was the simple fact that she hadn't really conversed with a man not employed by her in ages, and it felt nice. She really needed to look into taking some time off when this case was wrapped up.